Dave, 93,173. Go.
Yes. What do you want me to say?
What?
I mean, that's not the real number, but they had come up with a number. Basil DeVito was in charge of the number. Okay, and they did sell out. And just to be clear, okay, if that building could have held 93,000 people, they probably would have had 93,000 people in it, but it didn't. Basil DeVito came up with a number, and that was the biggest indoor building in the country at the time. And so the whole key was to announce a number that that building could not hold. So they announced a number that was more than the Rolling Stones and more than the Pope had drawn, although the actual most people was the Pope. And what ended up happening is that the Pope thing, I believe that the original announcement when the Pope came to the Pontiac Silverdome was 87 or 88,000 people. And then later, the 93,000 number came. So then years later, and when I talk years later, I mean a good 10 years later, the Pontiac Silverdome would have this thing, and it would be the largest attendance, and it was not WrestleMania, it was the Pope, and they created a fake number for the Pope because they were not going to put WrestleMania over the Pope because it didn't draw more people than the Pope. Mm-hmm. So they created 93,500 for the Pope, even though the night it happened, there were only 88,000 people in the building. But I mean, as far as the WrestleMania goes, according to, it was 78,000 people. And I know people go, oh, God, there's football. And I can't explain to you the number other than the guy who was the promoter of the show was Zane Bresloff, who later became a friend of mine. And there was a Hulk Hogan special on, and he called me up, and he just goes, man, they believe that Hogan and Linda, they actually believe 93,000. I go, Zane, I believe 93,000 too.
Yeah, what are you saying?
No. I go, because I mean, it's funny now because I was getting every attendance figure for WWE. The WWE supplied them to me in that period. And when they announced 93,000, I was thinking like, okay, it's probably, 80, 85, it's made up number because they made up all their numbers, right? And they would give me the real number. So on whatever it is, the couple days afterwards, the guy who was my contact, which was Louis Dondera, who was Pat Patterson's significant other, Louis calls me up, and you know what? It may have been Terry Garvin. It may not have been. I think it was actually it was Terry Garvin who called me up on this one. And I go, I try to remember. I go, so what was the WrestleMania number? And he didn't answer me. Okay. He just didn't answer me. He goes, well, it was $1,599,000, which I had already known that anyway. And I go, yeah, I know, 1.6 million. And I go, what was the attendance? And it's like, well, whatever they said. But he didn't say 93,000. And he just goes, but we only had 2,300 comps. So I figured, okay, it's not, for whatever reason, I thought, well, that means that it was a real number. Because I think I did say, so you're saying it's a real number? And I think he kind of said, well, it was the number we said, or something like that. It was really like beating around the bush. Where I should have thought immediately that's a fake number, but I don't know what the real number is. But, years later, Bresloff was telling me it's 78. And then I did a story years later, this is 2001, where when I was actually on very good terms with the people in the what's it called, the arena bookings with WWE, thanks to Vince. And I did a story on the real numbers of every show, and they gave me the real numbers of every show, all the stadium shows, because, we only had the fake numbers. And so, I mean, people will go, well, whatever. And it's like, I don't know. I just know that the WWE and Zane Bresloff and all them all have the same number. This is not some, it's not like the WWE doesn't have this number. It's the same number they have.
And the idea in announcing that number and how they picked those exact numerals is a mystery, but the idea in announcing that number, Dave, was we need to announce a number that nobody could ever exceed because this building actually doesn't hold that many people.
Exactly. And there was no other building in the country indoors. There were outdoor, there were the whatever, University of Michigan football stadium, right, or whatever.
But the indoor attendance record, as they said.
It was the world indoor attendance record. That was the idea. So they were going to announce a number that nobody could beat because there was no indoor facility in the world at the time that was that big. I mean, none of the domes anywhere in the world would were as big as the Pontiac Silverdome. I think that the Superdome, they cut down the Superdome capacity, but I seem to feel that the Superdome, I wonder, I guess maybe they never had that many for a football game because the football, you couldn't, maybe for football you couldn't get as many people in, because I always thought the Superdome was real big.
100,000 or something like that.
Yeah, and they never had the guts to do the Superdome. Now they in which we'll get to later, when WrestleMania 7, the idea was to do the 100,000,
right,
which didn't happen.
Now, where does this whole thing come from, Dave, that Hogan was afraid Andre wouldn't cooperate in the ring with him this night?
I don't know if it's just a folklore or Andre was just goofing off and teasing. The only thing I know is that I knew people in the company going into this show, and the only question was what's going to happen with Andre, because Andre was in very, very bad health at this point. His back was shot. He'd had back surgery, and he had no business in the ring. He was numb, like his feet were numb. I mean, that's how bad his back was at the time, and he could do very, very little. If you watch the match, you'll see he could do almost nothing. So there was a lot of fear that, like, if something happened before, what would happen? And I think that they had Orndorff kind of like, it would have been a disaster, but they were ready to go with Orndorff if there was a backup. And, the day came and Andre went and did as good as he could. But I mean, the idea that Andre was, not going to do the job for Hogan. I mean, Andre knew he was done. At the time this was going to be Andre's last match, he ended up coming back and wrestling, several more matches. For the next 6 years until he died, he continued to wrestle. But at this time, going into this match, the feeling was this was going to be Andre's last match. And Andre had already done his farewell, in Japan, even though he, in fact, came back to wrestle in Japan later as well. And he'd done his farewell in Mexico, where he put over Kanek, his farewell in Japan, where he put over Inoki clean in both cases. And so now it was time for him to do his farewell in the United States, and Hogan was clearly the guy to do it for. So he did it for him. And, that's, I mean, if there was like a practical joke aspect of it where, Andre's not going to be cooperative, he ain't going to do the job, what are you going to do? Could someone have said it to him? Yeah, perhaps. But the way the business was then, I just don't buy it. I mean, he was very cooperative on the way out everywhere else. Why would he not be for Vince?
And how about the legend that Andre called the body slam on the fly? I don't believe it. I feel like the whole match is built around it.
Okay, here's the thing. He did the same thing in the Inoki match and in the Kinect match.
There it is. Exact
same spot in both matches. So it was the finish of the Kinect match was the body slam. The Inoki finish was the body slam and an armbar submission. So no. I mean, and plus, they'd already done that spot in all their matches in the 1980 feud, and that's the most impressive spot of the matches. The memorable spot is the body slam. There's no way that spot wasn't built in to be the key spot of the match.
Do you think Andre really said "Slam me, boss" before Hogan got him up?
I might have. I don't know. but I mean, there's no question that match was laid out in its entirety before they ever got in the ring.
Speaking of laid out in its entirety, Dave, Randy Savage versus Ricky Steamboat. One of the all-time great matches. Tell me about, why how closely they scripted it, and how that was received at the time.
Yeah, they scripted move for move for a long time in advance, and I mean they were out there memorizing it, which at that time also was, that's not how in those days you did wrestling. I know, like with Steamboat, I mean it's funny because Steamboat will tell you now that like by far, he's most associated with that match than any match of his entire career. But for years, I remember, when people would ask, Ricky, what was your greatest match? Was it the Flair match or was it the Savage match? And he would always go, well, the Savage match was scripted move for move and the Flair match wasn't. So what does that tell you? And I mean, it's basically saying that the Flair match was. But after a certain number of years where, for whatever reason, the legend of the Flair match, which was quite a legend, didn't carry as much, I guess probably because WCW died and WCW wasn't as good at promoting history and things like that. And the Savage Steamboat became this all-time classic match. That became the match he was, linked with. And it was funny because him and Savage were linked together with that match, and they probably, I remember talking to him about this. I believe that they may have said a few words for the before, for the rest of their lives, even though they worked together, many matches at house shows for a couple of months until they kind of killed the program. But they never spoke, like they were not friends. They never like had phone calls years later. Remember, hey, remember that great match we had, which, up until the modern era was considered the best match in company history. They just never spoke.